First off, I want to be sure to let people know what office covers them. So I'm not assuming that everybody who is on this talk is from one of these 31 counties. We have had people register from all over the place, but there are 7 different offices that cover portions of North Carolina. So there's an office in Raleigh, in Wilmington, and Newport, North Carolina. Those 3 offices are physically in the state of North Carolina. Some of our counties are also covered by the Wakefield, Virginia office, the Roanoke, Virginia office, the Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina office, and the Morristown, Tennessee office. So going through the 2024 Atlantic tropical cyclone names, we have crossed off A, D, C, D, and E at this point, and we'll talk about the seasonal forecast a little bit later on, but we certainly expect to end up crossing off more of those. So a general outline for my talk, I'm going to be talking about the climatology of tropical cyclones first. I'll spend some time talking about National Hurricane Center products, hazards, and finally what you can do to prepare for these storms. So climatology, the hurricane season for the North Atlantic officially runs from June 1st through November 30th. The average date of a first named storm is July 9th, but the average date of the first hurricane is August 10th. We always end up talking about middle of September being kind of the peak of the season. This shows the average date of the first major hurricane. And again, that's going to be any category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane. So this climatology is a little bit old. It only goes through 2009. But again, you can end up seeing that over that, 43, 44 year period, we averaged 11 named systems, so something that was at least tropical storm strength, about 6 hurricanes, and 2 major hurricanes. Again, this is another way of looking at the climatology, and this does end up showing that y-axis is the number of storms per 100 years. So saying that on September 10th, we typically have somewhere between 90 and 100 storms in 100 years. So most years we're going to have something right around September 10th. But again, we can have the tropical systems anytime between May and November. So for the National Hurricane Center, this is the type of forecast that they end up issuing. The cone represents the probable path of the center of the storm. It's important to focus on that. The cone represents the probable path of the center of the storm. Now, these storms can end up being hundreds of miles wide, and their impacts can end up spanning hundreds of miles. This cone is not showing those impacts. It is just showing where the center of circulation can end up being. And it's important to note that the center of the storm passes within the cone roughly 2/3 of the time. So 1/3 of the time, the storm leaves the cone. Every time you're looking at a new forecast, the storm is always in the cone because the cone is always shifting a little bit with each forecast. Now, if you were to place a whole bunch of cones consecutively, then you could end up seeing that 1/3 of the time, the storm ends up leaving the cone. So by no means is it a certainty, but we actually have the error built into the forecast product itself in this case. Taking a look at a tropical cyclone track forecast, cone watches and warnings. Again, in this particular image from Hurricane Joaquin, you can end up seeing, it highlights the areas that are under the watch and the warning. So you can end up seeing, primarily this is focusing on warnings. It's not to say that I don't see any watches, but it's going to be to the Caribbean, to the southeast of Florida, where you can see the dark red. Those are the hurricane warnings, and the dark blue are the tropical storm warnings. You can actually also see a slight hint around those tropical storm warnings. I see a little bit of peach or pink, which looks like that they were also under a hurricane watch. This is one of the primary products from the National Hurricane Center. It shows the forecast track and the position forecasts. And the cone conveys the track and the strength errors, again, not the impacts. So to form the cone, a set of imaginary circles are placed along the forecast track at each forecast interval. Again, the size of each circle encloses 2/3 of the official forecast errors, and then the cone is formed by smoothly connecting the area set out by the set of circles. So the scheduled issuances are at 5 and 11 a.m. and p.m. during daylight time. This ends up focusing on 3, 9, 15, and 21 Zulu time, or UTC time, or Greenwich Mean Time. Those are all representing the same thing. There is a change to the forecast cone graphic that's occurred in the last week or two. And so this is just an example on the right. The image on the left shows the Hurricane Ian image as it was originally sent out. The right side ends up showing an example of a new change that the Hurricane Center is doing this year. And instead of just showing the watches and warnings along the coastline itself, this is now actually highlighting the inland watches and warnings. Again, on the left side, you can see that just the coastline is highlighted, but on the right image, you can end up seeing a good portion of Florida is highlighted in red for a hurricane warning. A good portion of Florida is highlighted in a tropical storm warning. And you can also see a tropical storm watch in northern Florida and southeastern Georgia. So considering our forecast area is not right along the coast, a forecast cone graphic change like this is very important to end up showing what those hazards are looking like in our local area. Taking a look at the official track air trend of the National Hurricane Center. They started issuing forecasts in 1954, and this is taking a look at things by decade. So not only can you see that in the last 25 years, they've started issuing the forecasts for a longer period of time, you can also see that each decade, the forecast continues to improve for the mileage. So a track air at 168 days, that's actually an internal forecast. The Hurricane Center only publicly releases 5-day forecasts. I've never even seen their internal 6-day or 7-day forecasts. It's not like we're looking at them at the local office. I've never seen one myself. But so that's saying that with that official forecast going out 120 days, that the average air for the center is about 200 miles. And every year, the cone is slightly changed. I know for 1 or 2 of these, I think they changed by a couple of miles. It was less than 5 miles. But every year, it's updating that size of the cone for the average air over the last 5 years. So the average air at 12 hours was 26 nautical miles. And so that's how wide the cone is at 12 hours. You can see going all the way down to 120 that in the last 5 years specifically, the average air has been 220 miles. So all that is built into the graphic itself. Here's another way to visualize how that ends up looking between 2005, 10, 15, and 20, and seeing how that particular storm, I'm not sure if it, obviously this was a storm, I don't know which storm it was or which track it is. You can end up seeing over that 15-year time period how the cone was able to shrink and how we were able to give a more precise forecast. I still can't believe this change in the cone between Floyd in 1999 and how big a 3-day cone was and how big it was in 2019. That's just so impressive, the improvement in 20 years that the Hurricane Center has managed to do. Taking a look at the official intensity forecast trend, you can see these changes have not been as large as the track ones. You can see that in the 70s and 80s and the 90s and the aughts, if you're looking at that 72-hour forecast, it changed by a couple of knots. A knot is a little bit more than a mile an hour. You can see there was a good bit of improvement in the last decade. And again, now those forecasts end up going out longer and everything, but still taking a look at 15 knots, that's still, that can, depending on where you are in the scale, that can end up being a full category strength of the hurricane. So again, we're always telling people to not focus on the exact specifics of the track, the exact specifics of the intensity. It's important to end up looking at the general trend. So what is the classification that we have? A tropical depression is something that's less than 39 miles an hour, sustained winds, not gusts, sustained winds. And there must be a closed surface circulation. Even if there's 35-mile-an-hour winds, if it's kind of open-ended, it's not considered a tropical depression. A tropical storm has sustained winds 39 to 73 miles an hour. A hurricane is 74 miles an hour or greater. And again, a major hurricane is 111 miles an hour or greater. Again, that would be at least a category 3. And the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale. I thought I had a pop-up that was going to come up here. One thing that I like to emphasize on this is that it is the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. It's used to categorize a hurricane strength, but it is using one variable, the wind. It doesn't look at what the pressure is of the storm. It doesn't look at how much rain there is. It doesn't look at what the storm surge is. It doesn't look at what the tornado threat could be. It's only using the wind. And there are many impacts that a hurricane can have other than wind. So I just really want to emphasize that you cannot use a single number on a hurricane wind scale to categorize all the threats from a hurricane. So again, I won't read all of these numbers out to you and everything, but again, hurricane category 1 starts at 74, 96 for a category 2, and the highest category is 157 miles an hour or higher. So this is showing the return period on average, how often a hurricane ends up affecting each of these coastal counties that we have along the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. So if you're at the very southern tip of Texas, that's saying that they are impacted, and I'll be honest, I don't know if this is that the hurricane moved over their county or exactly what the true methodology was for calculating this graphic, but it's saying that right along the Texas and Mexico border, they're impacted by a hurricane on average every 13 years. New Orleans and the Delta end up sticking out a little bit every 7 years. The Florida Peninsula sticks out. North Carolina ends up sticking out. You can actually see that 1 or 2 of the coastal counties up in Maine are the ones that are the most protected, having something come through about every 50 years, because it's kind of hard for something to recurve, because if it's recurving, it's probably heading east and not at, well, north as well. But there's normally some sort of an easterly component, so it's hard for it to loop its way around Cape Cod. This is taking a look at major hurricanes. And again, you see the same areas end up sticking out for that return period. Louisiana, Florida, and the Carolinas. But certainly there are some other places that you're looking in the orange along the Gulf Coast that's more likely than something along the Northeast, for example. So taking a look, I don't know if I should call these the new 1991 to 2020 seasonal averages, since this is the 4th year that they've been in effect. But dropping the 80s and adding the 20 teens, that ends up showing us that on average, we have 14 named storms, 7 hurricanes, and 3 major hurricanes. Part of this could be due to the overall improvement of observing platforms. How much better are the satellite images that are being used to help determine the strength of these? How many more dropsons or buoys do we have going into these systems to end up measuring them? It could be due to the warming ocean and atmosphere, which are influenced by climate change. That could end up having an impact on the fact that we have more storms. And it can also just reflect a very busy period over the last 30 years. So this is the 2024 Atlantic Hurricane Season Outlook, the update that came out about a week and a half ago. And before they had a small probability of below normal, I think it was 5%. And now the Hurricane Center and NOAA have removed what they think is that possibility. They have a 10% chance for a near normal year. And I don't know how wide of a berth they're giving themselves for near normal, but those numbers on the right are their broad forecasts, that it would be 17 to 24 named storms, 8 to 13 hurricanes, and 4 to 7 major hurricanes. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of the NHC products themselves. So the National Weather Service and the Hurricane Center end up working together. So the National Hurricane Center is in Miami. They forecast the track, they forecast the intensity, and they are taking care of all of the tropical cyclones around North America itself. And that is quite a sturdy building. I can't say that I've been there myself, but 10-inch thick walls, I would hope that would be able to handle a Category 5 hurricane. Meanwhile, if you take a look at our office on Centennial Campus, we are forecasting the impacts of a tropical cyclone. We're forecasting the threats for tropical cyclone. We are focusing on our 31 county local area. And in collaboration with the National Hurricane Center, we're deciding where and when to end up putting out watches and warnings. So the tropical weather outlook is issued before we have any hurricanes. I mean, there are some examples in this one and everything, but it's issued 4 times a day. It's at 2 and 8 a.m. and p.m. So again, the Zulu UTC Greenwich Mean Time, that's 0 and 6, 12 and 18. And this is looking at the tropical cyclone formation potential for the next 7 days. So this particular plot was pretty busy. It was showing something in the Gulf of Mexico, saying that there was between a 40 and 60% chance of something forming there. To the southeast of that, there was a greater than 60% chance of something impacting those islands. There was Tropical Depression 6, Tropical Storm Emily, and then another area just moving off of the Africa coast that had a 40 to 60% chance of formation sometime in the next 7 days. This says nothing about how strong any of those storms are going to get, just talking about whether a tropical system will form. So the watch phase is something that goes into effect within 48 hours. So a hurricane watch is when sustained winds, again, not gusts, sustained winds of 74 miles an hour or higher are possible within the specified area within 48 hours. And again, if the sustained winds of 39 to 73 miles an hour are possible, that's when a tropical storm watch would end up being issued. The warning is something that, again, the local offices in collaboration with the National Hurricane Center try to issue somewhere between 24 and 36 hours of when something is expected. So again, the hurricane warning, sustained winds of 74 miles an hour expected within 36 hours. Tropical storm warning would be the tropical storm criteria. One of the reasons that I wanted to create this presentation in the first place was to explain what a potential tropical cyclone advisory is, because there have been times, we've already had 1 or 2 this year where I don't remember if it was the D storm or the E storm, where I think they ended up having potential tropical cyclone 5, and they were putting out a tropical storm watch, even though it hadn't become a named storm yet. So potential tropical cyclone advisories are issued before a tropical depression or tropical storm forms. And that provides the National Weather Service to give the full 48 hours of lead time with a full 36 hours of lead time for a warning. So even if the system hasn't formed yet, if they're expecting it to form this way, the advisories can end up going out and watches and warnings can be issued. So this example is from last year. In the left image, it's showing potential tropical cyclone 9, and that was Monday at 10 a.m. Central Time. 6 hours later, the next issuance was made, and it was now tropical depression 9 at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. And then eventually it was tropical storm Harold. But you can end up seeing on that first image on the left that there was already a blue line along the coast of Texas indicating a tropical storm warning. Even though it hadn't been numbered, it hadn't been named, they anticipated that within the next 24 to 48 hours it would be there. So they were able to have the tropical storm warning out before the tropical cyclone had even formed into a tropical depression or tropical storm itself. The key messages graphic is something that the Hurricane Center always ends up putting together with several text bullets and a lot of information covering the storm as a whole. It will almost always have the 5-day cone listed on the graphic itself, and then they normally end up picking some other graphic to go with it. In this one, it happens to be a unexpected rainfall graphic. So key text messages from the discussion and any pertinent advisory graphics. This is available via the National Hurricane Center social media outlets and also on the NHC website. So some of the more specific products that they end up doing, this one again was from Hurricane Florence many years ago. This is the earliest reasonable arrival time of tropical storm force winds. So this is kind of the worst case scenario that is being put together. The earliest that these winds could end up approaching. And so this graphic was specifically issued by the Morehead City office. That broad map was the Hurricane Center graphic. But that text over on the right-hand side saying the tropical storm force winds could arrive as early as Wednesday evening, that's based on their location in that Wednesday 8 p.m. line approaching the Outer Banks. And so in general, we don't think about it being a particular hour, just kind of think of it as the evening. But yeah, as it says on the bottom bullet on the left, instead of thinking Wednesday 8 p.m., think of it as late Wednesday. We don't know exactly what's going to be going on with these storms to the hour. This is in contrast to the most likely arrival time of tropical storm force winds. A lot of storm experts end up saying that really all preparations should be complete before the tropical storm force winds end up arriving. So that's the reason for this one. Again, it identifies a window when preparation should be made by the earliest reasonable arrival time. This is the prediction of when those winds will actually arrive. And just like the last one, don't think Monday at 8 a.m., think Monday morning. You have to broaden that out a little bit. So let's see, so this is just kind of putting all of this on a single slide. I'll let it sit here for a second so you can end up reading it over. All right, let's talk about some of those particular hazards. Like I said before, the Saffir-Simpson scale is describing a tropical storm or well, a hurricane specifically with a single number, a single category, 1 through 5. The tropical cyclones produce a lot more than just wind. They have rainfall, flooding, storm surge, rip currents, wind, tornadoes. There are many threats other than just the wind. Water is typically what ends up killing. Again, this graphic was from research done 10 years ago. I don't know how much it's changed at this point, but storm surge ends up accounting for half of the deaths that ended up occurring in the United States in that 50-year period. And water had something to do with about 90% of the deaths. Wind, tornado, and other only making, 12% of the rest of the fatalities. This is taking a look back at Hurricane Florence from 2019. And this forecast was when the storm was about 200 miles east-southeast of Wilmington. And you can end up seeing that those colors do a pretty good job matching, especially over much of North Carolina. They thought it was going to rain a bit more in Virginia and the Richmond over to the Norfolk area. But those colors match up pretty well in North Carolina along the coast and everything. So the forecast was out there of how much rain there was going to end up being. But there were 17 flood-related fatalities, and 16 of them were in vehicles where people were driving into floodwaters. So that's something that we always hate to hear about. Lorenzo was the second deadliest 2019 Atlantic Basin storm, and all 19 direct fatalities were water-related. And you can see that didn't go anywhere near the United States itself, but there were a lot of rip current fatalities. Anytime you end up having a hurricane churning up the water out in the middle of the ocean, we are going to end up getting bigger waves, bigger swell, and that can end up causing rip currents. And that can be the case. You can see from here, it was all the way from Massachusetts all the way down to Florida that those rip currents were occurring. So rip currents, if you don't know what it is, it's when an area of water ends up coming in and instead of just kind of the normal waves coming in and going out, it will end up kind of cause a funneling effect, and it will funnel you out into the ocean. So one of the things that we end up saying is escape the grip of the rip. And so again, there's a lot on here. I'll be quiet for a second and let you read it over, but the most important thing to end up remembering if you are stuck in a rip current is that you want to swim parallel to the shore. Rip currents are not hundreds of yards wide. They're going to be relatively narrow channels of water pushing you out to sea. So you want to swim parallel to the shoreline so that you can end up getting out of the rip current. Tornadoes typically occur on the right side of the storm. This is the side where the winds tend to blow onshore because the winds are blowing counterclockwise. So this will bring warm, moist tropical air inland. As a hurricane is making landfall, the friction is slowing wind closer to the surface, while the winds higher up in the storm are still spinning rapidly. So that gives you a big change in speed of the wind with height, and that's a favorable wind profile for tornadoes to form. Tornadoes with tropical systems rarely have lightning, even more rarely have hail. It's just not something that ends up happening. So taking a look at this storm, I don't even know which storm it is in particular, but just saying that if the storm is moving from the southeast towards the northwest, the right front quadrant, kind of that northern portion of the storm, that's going to be where the danger is. Not only is the wind increasing with height, also the fact that you have the wind pushing against the water and then it ends up hitting the land, that also causes friction. So that kind of causes the air to back up a little bit and kind of stack up on itself, and that convergence can also help to cause tornadoes. This is a graphic that the North Carolina State Climate Office ended up putting together last week, taking a look at what ended up going on with Tropical Storm Debbie. So you can end up seeing the approximate rainfall there, and the fact that there ended up being 10 tornadoes in the state with Tropical Storm Debbie, including the EF3, which did end up having fatality. I can't remember if it was 140 or 145 mile-an-hour winds with that. So again, this was a tropical storm as it ended up moving through North Carolina. It wasn't even a hurricane at this point, but it was still able to produce 10 tornadoes, one of which was fatal. Some other products that we end up issuing are HTI. They're Hurricane Threat and Impact products. And so for our office, we are not worried about the storm surge threat. At least I certainly hope we're never going to be concerned about the storm surge threat at our office. The three that we end up focusing on here locally would end up being the wind, the flooding rain, and the tornado threat. And those are typically done in some amount of collaboration with national centers, such as the National Hurricane Center and the Weather Prediction Center. And so these graphics will end up being available, and they'll have those bright legends, the gray if nothing is a concern, but the yellow, orange, red, and purple showing the worst levels of a particular threat. Local time zones, they do this to confuse us. So again, if I said that the National Hurricane Center issues an advisory at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, that could be that might be with a storm being in the Central Time Zone, or it could be in the Eastern Time Zone, or it could be in the Atlantic Time Zone where it's 11 a.m. but it says Atlantic Standard instead of Eastern Daylight. If it's off the coast of Africa, it's Cape Verde time. If it's a bit farther north, it's Greenwich time. So these are all the local times, but again, the products will still end up being issued at 5 and 11 a.m. and p.m. If you want to take a look at some of our local pages, not all of these images are from the Raleigh page, but they are the equivalent of what you could end up seeing on our page with just samples from other offices. So Our website is weather.gov/RAH. That's our 3-letter identifier /tropical. So this is going to be a one-stop shop for you to get all the information that you're looking for. So that active storms tab, that second one, is going to become active whenever the Hurricane Center initiates tropical cyclone advisories. Most sites are similar to the southern region. We're an eastern region office, so it might end up looking a little bit different. There's certainly stuff you can scroll on, but you can see all these different tabs here: threats and impacts, local products, satellite, radar, social media, preparedness, and other links. The threat and impacts tab contains an HTI frequently asked questions page, but we'll also end up showing you the actual threats themselves when there is an active storm. Again, you can end up clicking on the radio buttons right above that image to end up looking at the wind threat, storm surge, flooding, rain, or tornado threat. And it'll give you an idea as to how much you need to prepare for each particular hazard with a given storm. Local products is going to be shown when there's an active storm, and it will show you the entire text of the hurricane local statement that is issued by your local office. And again, here's a list of some additional products: extreme wind warnings, coastal hazards, surf zone forecasts, flash flood warnings, flood warnings, local storm reports, post-tropical cyclone reports. That's after a storm is, a storm can still be strong and have very strong winds. But once it's considered to not be tropical anymore and it is post-tropical, those reports might be issued here as well. Satellite and radar data is always available whether there's a storm around or not. There's also a preparedness tab that will end up giving you quick access to local evacuation maps and other preparedness information. So again, some products that we are issuing locally. One of my coworkers ended up putting this together. What details can you reasonably expect from a hurricane forecast at different lead time? At the local office, we're doing 7-day forecasts. That's what we do. So anything longer than that is a broad idea. But the National Hurricane Center is not providing any explicit forecasts. We'll say it looks like it might develop, but that's about all we can end up doing. 5 to 7 days, we're starting to get a better idea of the possibilities. Sometimes we'll end up providing some emails to our emergency management partners with the latest forecast, but again, not a lot of detail. 3 to 5 days out is when we're starting to end up narrowing things down a little bit more. Again, for our emergency partners, we might end up doing some daily webinars. And then when we're within 24 to 48 hours, that's when we have a much better idea as to what we're expecting. We'll be having watches and warnings out in effect, and that's when we'll end up being able to provide that much more information. So the hazardous weather outlook is designed to alert customers to expected hazardous weather and its potential impact out to 7 days. This is something that we issue every single day, no matter what, even if it says that no hazards are expected. So for this particular one from September of 2018, it said Hurricane Florence is forecast to be a very powerful major hurricane as it approaches late Wednesday through early Friday. So it listed the particular threats and said that residents of Central North Carolina should get their emergency kits together at that point. There's also the Tropical Cyclone Local Watch and Warning Statement. So this is a good source of the meteorological threat and impact information on a small scale, and it's going to end up driving other downstream notifications. It will trigger the emergency alert system. It will trigger NOAA weather radio, the watch warning display, and wireless emergency alerts on your phone. This is not a good source of information for media and others who require a big picture. We have other products for that. And here's an example of a product from Florence, when Florence was coming in September of 18. So this was specifically for Cumberland County, talking about Fayetteville and Fort Bragg, saying the latest local forecast was the equivalent of tropical storm force winds, when that was forecast and when the window was in effect for that, and then what the potential threat was, what the highest might end up being. That's opposed to a hurricane local statement, which is a concise summary of the significant potential impacts. And this is a good source of information for the media and others who require the big picture. It is not what you would want to end up using to figure out what's going to end up happening at your house. and it is not a source of official watch and warning information because it's trying to sum up the entire area in a single statement. So this is, again, one issued from Raleigh for Florence. And again, it says changes to watches and warnings, none. It specifically says where 2 counties had a hurricane warning and then several more counties had a tropical storm warning. A broad idea of where the storm is and a latitude, longitude along with the storm intensity, and then the situation overview. So all of these are different pieces that you would end up seeing. The areas affected, headline, new information, all of that. All of those sections would be included in an HLS. This takes a look at the map at the different offices that end up issuing tropical products. Was it just last year or was it 2022 that San Diego was putting out some products as they ended up having something that came up from Pacific Ocean? So this is something that these are the offices that have had some amount of impact from storms inland, as opposed to just being along the coast itself. So you can end up seeing all the different products these offices end up issuing. Wireless emergency alerts. You're most likely aware of these due to tornado warnings or flash flood warnings. And a WEA, a wireless emergency alert, is an alerting network in the United States designed to disseminate emergency alerts and what might be triggered from tropical storms would be hurricane warnings, extreme wind warnings. We would not end up issuing any storm surge warnings, our office in particular. But an extreme wind warning is when the winds are expected to be of the major hurricane category strength, at least 111 miles per hour. No matter what, you can always go to weather.gov/RA and look at the point and click forecast. You can end up looking at the hourly forecast that we have, check on and off any weather parameters you want, take a look at what the trends are, and a digital readout with the numbers is available, as you can see on the bottom left, as opposed to the plots going up and down with the charts on the bottom right-hand side. And then you can also go to weather.gov/forecast points, and you can end up having a particular point that you want to look at. And I'll just leave these graphics up here for a second so you can take a look at the different information available on this. All right, let's talk about some preparedness for these systems. Before the hurricane season, or you can do it right now, that's fine. You can see about developing an evacuation plan, assemble your disaster supplies, make sure you have food, water, batteries, charger, radio, and cash on hand. Suppose everybody trying to make a run to the ATM at the last minute. You'll want to make sure that you have all of your possessions documented for the sake of insurance. You'll want a communication plan with a handwritten list of contacts that you don't have to worry about losing if the power goes out and you can't get to something. And just make sure that your home is reinforced. Again, more things to do before the storm. Determine your risk. Already mentioned the evaluation plan, disaster supplies, and insurance checkup. Strengthen your home. Know how to cover the windows. Help your neighbors. Make sure that they're going to be doing all right as well. And complete a written plan and make sure that somebody outside of the area is aware of your plan as well. Again, what might you want to have in your disaster supply kit? You're going to want to make sure that you might be able to survive for a week because it could end up being that long until your power is restored. Power ends up going out, it can get cold, so you'd want to have blankets along with pillows. You're going to want to make sure that you have some waterproof flashlights. You're going to want some sort of a weather radio or an AM/FM radio to end up getting the weather alerts that you end up needing. Again, those ATMs won't be working if there isn't any power, so you probably want to make sure that you have some cash ahead of time. Once a hurricane watch has been issued, you're going to want to be monitoring your NOAA weather radio and your local media. Get that disaster supply kit ready. Make sure you have gas in your automobile. Don't drive around with 30 miles left on the gas tank. Decide if you're going to evacuate where you're going to go, and make sure that you have enough time to get there. There may be tens of thousands of people trying to go to the same place you are, and you can have a lot of congestion along those routes. The hurricane warning generally means you're less than 36 hours before the impact. Make sure to pay attention for and heed any evacuations. If you end up evacuating, you'll want to turn off your main water and gas supplies. You'll want to make sure that you bring emergency supplies, warm clothing, blankets, and sleeping bags. Or if you decide you want to shelter in place, stay as far away from the exterior walls and windows as you can. Make sure you have a lot of flashlights and batteries, and act by the same rules that you would for a tornado. You want to, again, make sure that you're away from those exterior walls and windows and be in as safe a place as you can. After the storm, you want to continue to monitor the media to make sure there's nothing in particular that you need to know about. If you're on the road, you probably don't want to come home until you're advised to by the authorities. There might just be many trees and power lines down. You might not be able to make it home. Make sure that any food that you have at your house has not been spoiled before you consume it. You know, was the power out for 1 day or 5 days? Well, by the time you end up getting home, if you left town, everything in your freezer might be frozen again. That doesn't mean that it didn't completely thaw and refreeze. So be especially careful about that. You'll want to take pictures of the storm damage before you alter it for your insurance purposes. Make sure that there aren't any gas leaks, electrical system damage, or any issues with your water lines. You'll want to make sure that your water is fresh. So if you still have ice cubes, see about melting them and drinking your water. So that ends up wrapping up things with the presentation. I just want to give some acknowledgments to people who made contributions to this. I borrowed aspects from a presentation that Chris Strong put together at the Sterling, Virginia office, Eric Heaton at the Morehead City, North Carolina office, Jesse Smith at the Melbourne, Florida office, and National Weather Service Southern Region headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas. And I also want to thank Chrissy Anderson, one of my coworkers at the Raleigh office.